DA Wolfson is seeking execution warrants for 3 people right now, but Nevada hasn't executed anyone in almost 20 years. So why does Clark County keep seeking the death penalty? Today on CityCast Las Vegas, I'm with Review Journal reporters Caitlin Newberg and Noble Brigham and Capital Defense Attorney David Figler to try and find out. Before we dive in, we want to give you a heads up. Today's episode contains detailed descriptions of violent crimes that some listeners may find disturbing. It's Monday, May 4th. I'm Jesse Merrick, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. You guys have heard us over the last couple of days inviting new folks to join our CityCast Las Vegas Neighbors program because we're in the thick of our spring membership campaign. And in fact, we actually have 1 week left, so jump on board with us. You've heard us talk about some of the cool perks that come along with being a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor, like exclusive podcast content and members-only events as well. But today we want to linger on another great perk, our neighborhood shoutouts. And David, you've sat in this chair. You've been around so many of these shoutouts over the year. I'm curious, what about that perk is exciting to you?
Well, it's fantastic. First of all, Jesse, all 4 of us that are on the program today are all downtowners, basically.
Yeah.
So we know downtown. We love shouting out downtown. But one of my favorite things is hearing from everyone else who are CityCast listeners. Look, CityCast Las Vegas is clearly not just about downtown. It's about the entire valley. And I love hearing shout outs from Blue Diamond. I love hearing shout outs from Green Valley, from Summerland, from Mesquite. We've had Mesquite shout outs. So it's a really cool perk. And not only do you shout out your neighborhood per se, but really cool places that are in your neighborhood. So it could be your favorite cafe, your favorite barista, could be your favorite restaurant, retail, whatever, library. We got library shout outs from different parts of the community too. So I think it's a really fun perk because you really get to be a little proud of your neighborhood.
Yeah, I love it. Like, I remember when I was a listener before I joined on as host, hearing people shout out different things that I maybe wasn't as familiar with. I'm like, ooh, I gotta go check out that local shop, that restaurant, you name it. That was one of the cool parts about it. And you only get to do that if you become a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor. So go ahead and jump in on the fun and get involved in these neighborhood shout outs. We want this show to shine a light really on what makes this city great as a whole. And as a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor, you get to help us do that. So to become a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor, go to membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas and sign up. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas. To make it easy for you, we threw the link down in the description, so go check it out. Noble, Caitlin, David, how's everybody doing today?
Hi, good. Thanks for having us.
Yes, fine. Thank you, Jesse.
Ready for a heavy conversation, Jesse.
Yeah. This is going to be a deep one today. I'm really interested because there's just so many layers to this one. And so I guess before we do dive into it, Noble and Caitlin, you guys just wrote an incredible investigation series into Clark County's use of the death penalty. So to kind of lay it out for the listeners at home, what are the parameters of using the death penalty under Nevada law right now?
Well, in order to seek the death penalty, prosecutors have to have one or more aggravators in the murder in which they want to seek it. And so those aggravators can be a pretty wide variety of things. They can be things like that the murder was committed for financial gain, that the murder involved torture, that the murder involved sexual assault, that it was a random killing. And once they have that aggravator, they can take it to what in Clark County is called the Death Penalty Review Committee. And then that committee, which is made up of prosecutors, decides whether or not the DA's office is actually going to pursue the death penalty.
And I think what's important to note is that DA Steve Wolfson has said that he has the final say in this. So he's part of this Death Penalty Review Committee, but ultimately he decides which cases prosecutors are going to pursue the death penalty in. And to do that, they need to file what's called a notice of intent to seek the death penalty, which is just really a document that says, hey, we're doing this. And not every case makes it a trial. A lot of people plead guilty, but that is how you get the process rolling.
Okay. And so the last execution was in 2006. How many of those cases have been pursued since then?
Yeah, so for the story that Noble and I did, this was my job to quantify this number. And what we found is that prosecutors in Clark County have pursued the death penalty against about 225 people in the last 20 years since the last person was executed. Of those people, only 20 of them were actually sentenced to die, and only 9 of those 20 still remain on death row. The others either have died on death row or they've had their cases overturned.
David, on behalf of clients, you've appeared in front of the Death Penalty Review Committee. So I guess kind of along the lines of this conversation here, what is it that makes it unique about the way that Clark County does use the death penalty like we were talking about here?
Well, it's unique because it's kind of made up and there are no rules to it and it's not recorded and it's not challengeable. Some of my colleagues, I'm not going to say I do, refer to it as kind of a star chamber where, the district attorney has made a preliminary determination whether or not they're even going to go to this death review committee. Now, understand, only cases where they believe they can get a first-degree murder conviction are eligible for the death penalty. No other case in the system, no matter how serious it is, if it's not first-degree murder, it's not eligible for a death penalty. And as Noble indicated, it's very broad which cases are even eligible for the death penalty. And I would argue that if you use a gun, if you have any kind of criminal record, that it's almost impossible to find a case. It's possible, but most cases do have some manner of aggravator, at least arguably, in the system. So there's a first round basically where the prosecutors who are assigned to a murder case make a determination whether or not they want to submit it to this death review committee. Let's assume that they say, yes, we want this death review committee to decide whether or not we're going to move forward with the death penalty as a possible option in the case. Well, they'll convene this committee, and it's about, I don't know, last time I was in there, which was really in the last 2 months, maybe a dozen or more prosecutors who are very, very somber looking. And what they basically do is they say, give us your pitch why your client shouldn't have the death penalty as an option in this particular case. And presumably as a defense attorney, and sometimes we ask for extra time because there are time limits that are involved in any case where the prosecution is seeking death penalty, we'll do some research about the mental health status, maybe the background, maybe some facts about the particular case. We have to be very judicious in what we present to this death review committee because there's no rule that says that if we tell them something, we're not giving away a strategy or giving away things that we shouldn't too early. But we do try to make our best sort of compelling argument. Infrequently, they ask questions, but sometimes they do. Steve Wilson is present there. He's running the show. And then you kind of give your little 5-minute spiel. And if there's no questions, it's a very awkward silence. And then you leave the room. And then, within an hour or so, you get a phone call that either says, yes, we are seeking the death penalty, or no, we're not. That's the process. It's very made up.
So, Noble, obviously this sounds like such, a complicated, kind of convoluted process. And in the meantime, Clark County is filing, these at such a high rate. So why are they pursuing the death penalty at such a high rate? I guess what's the reasoning here?
Well, we spoke with Steve Wolfson about that, and he told us that he believes that the death penalty still has merit because he believes that public opinion is in favor of the death penalty. He also talked about how, in his view, the death penalty is used in a small number of cases that represent the worst of the worst, that these are pretty extreme homicides. And so he does consider public opinion. He said that he will not seek the death penalty for a defendant if he believes that a jury would not award the death penalty.
Hey listeners, it's your host Jesse. We'll get back to the show in just a sec, but real quick, I want to tell you about something we just added for our CityCast Las Vegas neighbors that I'm so stoked about. Every Friday after the regular show wraps, neighbors get access to an exclusive bonus segment and a special members-only ad feed. And no, I'm not talking about filler content, okay? I'm talking about the stuff that I actually want to say, but doesn't necessarily always fit into the regular show, like deeper dives into the hottest local happenings or insider tips to get you set for the weekend ahead. This is for the listeners who really want to dig deeper into the city with me and the rest of our CityCast team as well. If that's you, become a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor. You'll get the Friday bonus segment, plus ad-free listening, invites to members-only events, a weekly preview of the best things happening around the city, and so much more. It's $10 a month or $100 a year, and it goes directly to supporting this show and the team of locals who make it happen every day. You can read more and become a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor at membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas. After you become one of our neighbors, I'll see you in the bonus segment. Hey, we'll get back to the interview in just a second, but remember when we were talking about neighborhood shoutouts? One of the many great perks CityCast Las Vegas neighbors get? Well, we've already got a really great one to share with you. Eliza T says Valhallan Esports helps kids 8 through 17 build teamwork and other skills through coach gaming in a safe environment. And she's also got a hot tip for you as well. She says to ask about Parents' Night Out. So make sure you check out Valhalla Esports and take advantage of her hot tip. Now, if you've got a favorite nonprofit or a business that also deserves their moment on the podcast, become a CityCast Las Vegas neighbor today and submit a shout out of your own. Sign up at membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas. Now let's get back into the show. Does there need to be more, I guess, a clear defined thing of what the worst of the worst actually means? Because is 220 really the worst of the worst over that time frame?
I think a lot of lawyers will tell you that cases are very fact specific. So something like homicide cases obviously are going to inherently be very emotional. They're tragedies. Someone has died, sometimes in horrific, horrible ways. And I can't imagine being in a position to look at someone and say, yes, you lost your loved one and that's so sad, but it's not quite as bad as this other case. Yeah. So when we're talking about worst of the worst, I think it's really inherently hard to define. And laws are supposed to define these things, but thankfully I'm not a lawyer because it's difficult.
We'll leave that to David.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge. It's constantly a challenge. And, we look to places like the legislature to fix things, but unfortunately, it seems as though the legislature and governors in the past, whether they be Democrat or Republican, don't really want to touch reform of the death penalty in any way with a 10-foot pole. Even modest reforms. I mean, part of the problem that was pointed out in the Review Journal's reporting from some observers' take was that the Senate Majority Leader, Nicole Cannizzaro, and the head of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, Melanie Scheibel, were employees of the District Attorney's Office when the discussions about reforms on the death penalty were occurring, and they were killed. They didn't recuse themselves as it being a potential conflict. They didn't feel that they had to, and I guess that's their position. There was some litigation about all that. That said, they're not there anymore. Well, at least Cannizzaro is not. She's seeking higher office. So, it is really interesting how we can fix some of these ambiguities and make it a more equitable and fair system. Look, years ago, Harvard came and did a review of how the death penalty works in Clark County. They said that we were one of the top 3 or 4 places that seek the death penalty. Just seeking the death penalty has its own consequences. But they also pointed out that the kinds of people who get the death penalty tend to be poorer, less education. There are a lot of cultural factors that distinguish people against whom the death penalty is sought. And then one of the other factors that kind of seems to play a role, though, again, it's very hard to quantify, is even the race of the victim, that it is sought more when the victim is not a person of color than when it is. Not to say that they don't seek it all the time, because obviously they do, but there's all these different factors that I would say merit more than every 10 years an audit of how much this is actually costing our community. I think that both Noble and Caitlin would love if there was more updated data that they could get into and report upon. But for whatever reason, the legislature is just staying away from it now.
It would make my job a lot easier if there was more reports and study on this, yeah.
We would love if there was cost data. I think it would also be great if there was data that showed comparisons of the ways that different jurisdictions pursue the death penalty. Because I think a lot of defense attorneys in Clark County feel that Clark County is an outlier. Scott Coffey, who we spoke with for this series, who's been tracking the death penalty for decades, considers Clark County to be an extreme outlier nationally in the rate in which it pursues the death penalty. But it's hard to confirm that because nobody really has current data to refute or back that up.
How do we push to get that data? Because that was my question as I'm going through it, is how do we actually stack up to these other jurisdictions? And that's something that I feel like is pretty necessary, right?
Well, the use of the death penalty is in decline in the United States. And I think support for the death penalty, because of many of the reasons we've discussed, many of the reasons that are highlighted in the RJ's reporting on this, and I think just common sense suggests that people don't see a return on investment, that it maybe is more under the category of, yeah, we hate these people, so let's do the ultimate punishment versus a benefit to the community in as far as like deterrence or less crime or anything like that. For the first time in a long time, less than half of the states in the United States have an active death penalty. There are a number of states that have a moratorium in place, which I think puts it under 25 states where you can still get the death penalty right now as we speak. And I think that popular opinion has also declined over the decades. Now, if you ask people straight up questions, you believe in the death penalty or not, you're probably going to get a higher number than if you ask them a little bit more probing questions like, do you think that it's a value? Do you think it deters crime? Do you think that it is fairly applied? And the type of questions that might shape D.A. Wolfson's position on what public opinion really is about the death penalty.
And that's where I wonder, too, with not necessarily public opinion, but also just the people that have been through this, the victims' families. And for Caitlin and Noble, I know you guys spoke to some family members that are wrapped up in all of this. What's their thoughts on just this whole process that just seems so convoluted?
Well, I spoke with a couple family members who have a personal stake in this debate for the series that we did. One of the stories in this series is about the circumstances of the last execution, which was of a man named Daryl Mack who committed a murder in Reno. And the family of the woman Mack killed, he actually killed two women, but the family of the victim whose murder led to the death penalty approved of the death penalty for him, felt like it was appropriate. Other victims' families feel differently. After Wolfson announced that he was going to be seeking these execution warrants, my colleague Akaya Dillon and I were calling around trying to reach victims' relatives for the three defendants for whom Wolfson wanted to seek the execution warrants. And one of them actually told me that she considered the decision to seek a death warrant gross, in her words, and didn't understand why anybody would want to be a killer like Floyd, and didn't understand the endless amount of money and effort spent on appeals, and thought Floyd should just stay in prison. And we quote another victim's relative in the data story talking about her ambivalence and how she initially had wanted the death penalty for the guy who killed her husband, but eventually was fine with him just staying in prison for life. And so I think, like, if you talk to victims' families, just like the general public, there's some ambivalence, there's a range of emotions about the death penalty. And I think a lot of them, even if they didn't realize it at the time that the crime was committed, have realized that the death penalty doesn't mean an execution anytime soon. And sometimes the reality of those delays and all of the litigation may change the way that they feel about it.
And we've laid out this whole case for a lot of the reasons why it maybe doesn't make sense to pursue the death penalty. Conversely, where and when and why does it make sense to actually pursue it? I feel like we have to dive into that.
Well, like Noble was saying earlier, I think prosecutors will consider aggravating factors when they're looking at which cases they are pursuing the death penalty in. So, I mean, obviously there are some cases that are terrible and that they feel like this is a tool that they can use and that is legal in Nevada and that at least some victim family members want to see happen.
Zane Floyd, I think, is a good example of, like, basically an extreme murder case, right? Like, Zane Floyd had sexually assaulted a woman before he committed this shooting. He went to an Albertsons supermarket, killed 4 employees at that supermarket, also shot another employee who did survive. And so, I don't think it's for us as reporters to say, like, when it's appropriate to seek the death penalty, but prosecutors are seeking the death penalty in what they would consider to be more extreme murder cases.
And that's part of what D.A. Wolfson has said publicly, and that he has been quoted in this series in the Review Journal, is that he really does believe that it is the worst of the worst. And certainly Zane Floyd is one of those cases. If anyone was around during that time, they remember exactly what occurred. I think that the ultimate irony here, Jesse, is that, at the end of the day, when you're in front of a jury and the prosecutors are asking them to literally sign the death warrant for the defendant, they say that there's no other appropriate sentence. That's actually the standard, that if there's no other appropriate sentence than the death penalty, that the jury should go ahead and seek the death penalty. But oftentimes, especially, as of late, these cases do negotiate. In other words, the prosecutors seek the death penalty, and then the defendant, the person charged, will enter a plea to something that gives him something less than that. In other words, life in prison or even life with the possibility of parole, et cetera. So if even in the prosecutor's mind there was another penalty appropriate, I'm not saying that they shouldn't deal cases, but I am saying that, when they seek the death penalty and they say to a jury with a straight face, this is the only appropriate penalty, but they have also considered giving a different penalty if the person just pleads guilty, I think you could see the problem in inconsistency and real conviction when it comes, pardon the pun, to these death penalty cases.
And when we talk about consistency, I also think it's worth considering that in some cases there are co-defendants who are all accused of committing a murder together. And of course, co-defendants may have different degrees of involvement in a killing, but sometimes the sentences that they receive are not equal. And so one of the defendants for whom Wolfson's pursuing an execution warrant is Sterling Atkins. And Atkins had multiple co-defendants, one of whom was his brother. Sean actually took a plea deal and got life with the possibility of parole. Another co-defendant was also sentenced to death. And so, there's a case where 3 people were all involved in this murder and received different punishments.
I was once talking to a former judge now, an esteemed retired judge named Stuart Bell, who was also a district attorney before that. And he said to me, he goes, we could solve this whole death penalty problem if we only seek the death penalty when someone has killed more than one person. In other words, not that you aren't accountable, but that anyone could be in a position where and this was Judge Bell's position, at least at the time, that anyone can be in a situation where they don't know what it's like to take another human's life, and whatever the circumstances are, they do it. But then knowing that feeling, if they do it again, that all those people should be eligible for the death penalty and exposed to the death penalty, and no one else. That was kind of his take. And I think he said that a little tongue in cheek, but to narrow down the pool definitely creates this more of an idea of consistency and transparency and maybe even appropriateness when it comes to this very complicated area, very expensive area that, thank goodness, you have great reporting like what Noble and Caitlin and their colleagues are doing. And they do this every now and again. I remember their editor, David Ferrara, did a great piece about the faces of death row, and he listed every single person on death row and explained kind of why they're there. And we do tend to forget about people once they're incarcerated, but it always comes back in the news when things like what's happening right now, when they're seeking to actually execute them, occurs, and we start these conversations up again. I think these conversations should happen on a more regular basis.
And not only are they seeking to execute someone right now, but we just marked 20 years since Nevada actually carried through with an execution. So we're still pursuing the death penalty. We're still putting people on death row. But the question I was interested in our reporting is, why are we doing this if none of the executions are being carried out?
Yes,
and it's not following through.
First of all, that most of the people executed in the modern death penalty era in Nevada, which is since the 70s, have been volunteers. So they're people who basically agreed or even wanted for the state to kill them. So one of the attorneys who had represented Mack, who was a public defender in Washoe County, Jeremy Bosler, called the death penalty in Nevada the most inefficient, brutal, and expensive assisted suicide program in the world.
Yeah, so that's the question then as we wrap here for Caitlin and Noble. How do we fix this system? David laid out a little bit of a pathway to get there. From your reporting, is there anything that you've gathered that could help move us in the right direction here?
I think it just comes down to questions of why legislatures haven't seriously looked at this. Obviously, the DA's office and DA's offices across Nevada are still pursuing the death penalty because it is legal and because, these district attorneys feel like it is appropriate and necessary for some of these horrible, horrible cases. But if it is so ineffective, lawmakers have the power to stop this in Nevada. And they haven't. Last time they tried, it died in the legislature. So I think it would probably take lawmakers looking at this seriously for anything to change. And, our roles as reporters is kind of just to inform people of what's going on and make sure we document everything.
And I think when you say, like, how do we fix this, it kind of depends on where your position is. Like, if you're somebody who's pro-death penalty, your solution to how to fix the status quo of the death penalty in Nevada is probably very different than a defense attorney who opposes the death penalty. I think most people would probably agree. I mean, it's just objectively true that the process moves slowly. I think people would disagree about whether that's even a problem. So, like Caitlin said, our role is not to say we think this is what Nevada should do to reach the goals that we think is appropriate. We just represent the different sides of the story and show where things are now, and then policymakers and decision makers can decide what to do with that, if anything.
Thank all of you for your time, because this was a very interesting topic that we dove into today, a really heavy topic, and you guys handled it with grace.
Yeah, thank you for having
Jesse.
us.
Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend? Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our free morning newsletter. And don't forget, we're in the thick of our spring membership campaign. A handful of you have already jumped on board and become CityCast Las Vegas neighbors since we launched the campaign last week. So why not join the rest of your neighbors and snag that limited edition pennant that you can only get if you sign up by Friday, May 8th. It's coming up quick. So to do so, head to membership.citycast.fm/Las Vegas, which is linked down in the show notes of today's episode to make it even easier for you. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Until then, take care.